Welcome back to That's Academic. I'm Stephen Thomson. Now, if this is your first time on this channel, please do check out the other videos that I have uploaded. They generally fall into two categories. In some interviews, I'm interviewing guests who are professors from around the world, and we're discussing some of the hot topics in academic life, research, teaching, and other commitments too. And in the other category of videos, it's me talking, giving tips and some advice for early to mid-career researchers. So do check out the other videos that I have up on the channel. Now, in this episode, it's quite exciting because I'm speaking to the first non-lawyer on this channel. I'm a lawyer, but we don't just want to hear from lawyers all the time, do we? So we're starting to mix things up, and I'm delighted that my first guest is a computer scientist, so really from a very different field. He is Dr. Brian Harrington, Associate Professor of Computer Science at the University of Toronto. And in our discussion, we're looking at assessment of student competence and university exams, and perhaps what we can do to be a little bit more innovative in this area. Brian, thank you so much for speaking to me today.
Oh, happy to be here.
So I think what's really interesting, you're actually the first guest I've had on this channel who's not in the same field as me. Now, that's also partly because I can't just talk to people in my own field. I want people in all disciplines to be, looking in, contributing their insights, and obviously so that they find this channel useful too. But, you're in computer science, I'm in law, but fundamentally we're both still academics, okay? In the context of teaching, assessments, and also running exams, assessing student competence, I know that you gave a TEDx talk a few years ago where you were discussing the purposes or the objectives or the aims of the whole assessment exercise. And if I was to put the question out in terms of what is it we're trying to do in a student exam, what is it we're trying to assess, your answer to that, I think, is a little bit more nuanced, right? It's actually a deceptively simple question, I think. So what do you think are the core purposes of assessments when you're writing exams and also when you're marking them?
So, yeah, I think most people think of an exam, an assessment, any type of assessment is to evaluate what do you know. And I always like to push back on that and say, I think the real point is to ask, what did you learn? In a perfect world, what I would find out from an assessment is, what did the student know at the end of my course that they didn't know at the beginning of my course? Why is this important? Well, because most of the stuff that you know at the end of my course, you're not going to know a year from now. You will forget, you will get rusty, things will change, especially in a field like computer science, and I think probably in a lot of legal fields as well. The world changes so rapidly that what I taught you in my course isn't actually going to be relevant 6 months, a year, 5 years from now. What I actually care about evaluating is how much information were you able to absorb and assimilate and present back to me during that time. So instead of being an evaluation of what's in your brain at the given moment, what I really want an exam to be is, how good are you at absorbing and processing information? Instead of just being, here's what you know, it's here's what you've been able to learn in a relatively short period of time under given constraints.
I couldn't agree more that knowledge is not static, and you're right, in law it's constantly changing. And I always say to the students, well, this cannot just be a memory exercise, because if it is and then the law changes, well, you're stuffed, you're starting all over again. So it's about the skills, where do you find the current law as it stands? How do you interpret that? How do you synthesize different sources and so on? Are you saying then that this is this all about not just assessing knowledge, but assessing skills, problem-solving skills, how you apply the knowledge maybe to a set of facts? Or is it also almost an exercise in and of itself? And what I mean by that is, it doesn't really matter fundamentally, within reason, what it is you are specializing in or what it is you're learning. It's more just about, can this person be given this volume and complexity of information and then actually pass an exam on it?
Yeah, I think so. I think our institutions are still stuck in an old mode. The reason you used to go to a university as a student was because that was the storehouse of information. You wanted to go to the university that had the biggest and best library because that's where the information resided, and that's where you wanted the academics to gather. In the modern world, I have more information at my fingertips right now than I could ever process that any of us could ever process in our lives. The skill set is not about acquiring information. It's about processing and filtering information. And so what does that mean? That means our institutions that are still set up to sort of say, okay, you're going to spend 4 years of undergraduate research stuffing your head with facts. And at the end of those 4 years, you are going to regurgitate as many facts as you can. So we say, okay, you're now a miniature version of us. You're a miniature warehouse of information who's going to go out there. We're still sort of evaluating students based on that, but that's not what the skill sets that are going to help them in today's world. The skill sets that are going to help them in today's world are, let's assume you have access to essentially limitless information. How can you process that? How can you manage that? How can you assimilate and filter that and then apply it to a given task? So I always say, I would rather take on an A+ student from a different field who has those skills and can work with new information than a B- student from my field who, okay, I've got this good storage warehouse of information, but I don't have the skills to build on that.
So does that affect the way in which you write questions? Is it more about, what you put into the exam in terms of its content? Or does it affect more the way in which you mark the papers? Or is there a bit of both?
I think it's a bit of both. So one of the things I always explain to students, and this is something that I think students in post-secondary have to get used to. A lot of students I find coming from sort of high school or school level, they're used to that regurgitation model. And even in some fields, they still do focus on that sort of regurgitation model. And I always tell students, if I ask you a question on an exam that you have seen before, that was a bad question, because that is just testing whether or not you memorized something. The question on an exam should always be, can you take what we've learned and apply it to something new, to a new situation, to some wrinkle, some difference? Because that should be what I'm assessing. It's not what do you know, it's how can you apply these things that you've learned. And those aren't easy, right? It's very, very easy to ask content questions, to just say, here's a list of things we asked you to memorize. Please tell me how many of them you still remember. It's much trickier to get questions where you are assessing them in something novel, but not so novel that they can't apply what you've learned. And that, to me, is the real trick of creating the questions and then marking the questions in such a way that you are evaluating them based on that, based on not just, okay, did they remember the formula? It's did they apply it correctly? So it does make things more difficult. It can't just be, did they get the right answer? It's did they get through the right steps?
I'm interested to know if this is the same in your field, your discipline, as in mine. Is there a practice, either in your institution or in your discipline, of giving students model answers, so-called model answers, before exams?
In a lot of places there are, and that's actually something I've been fighting back against. I have a lot of students complain that Brian never gives solutions, either to prior exams or to the assignments or midterm exams that I give. And I always push back to say, yeah, I don't. And it's not just because I'm lazy and don't feel like making model answers. In fact, I usually do make model answers that I give to my teaching assistants who are helping me do the marking. It's actually because I've found, and this is something actually I'm working on studying, but I don't have good data to support this yet. But I found that students, given model answers, what they learn is they learn the answers as opposed to how to come to the answers. So what I always encourage students to do is instead of me giving you answers, I want you to come up with solutions, and I will help you come up with those. I will help you improve those. I will help you work on those. Because that's a very different thing, right? You say, okay, I got question 3 wrong on the exam. What was my answer supposed to be? I read that, I go, oh, okay, I now understand it. If I were to ask question 3 again next time, that will help you. But if I ask a slightly different version, doesn't necessarily mean it will help you. If instead I got question 3 wrong on the exam, okay, I'm going to try it again, given the feedback, and you tell me if it's correct. And then if it's still incorrect, I'm going to try it again. Eventually, you're going to come to a correct answer, but now you've gone through that process. You've done the thing. You could now answer that question. So on the next exam, when there's a slightly different version of it, you now know the process, not just the answer.
It's a great distinction you've drawn, and we're on the same page then with the model answer thing, because some of my colleagues have given these model answers and I've tended not to. And one of the reasons I do that is because a lot of students, when they come in to study law, as an undergraduate, and I was as guilty of this, back in the day as anyone, is they think that the law is black and white, and it's all about learning what the law is, and that's the end of it. And then it's only when they're studying this thing that they realize, actually, it's all about the grey middle. That's where the difficulty and the complexity lies. It's also where the money lies. And I try to get them out of this mindset of a right and a wrong answer, because ultimately, in law, in the practice of law, disputes end up in court. And you have at least 2 feasible interpretations of the law put forward in a court in an environment where complex reasoning processes and so on are applied. And I always say, if it's just a case of right and wrong, then, well, why don't we just get a computer to be a judge rather than a human? Well, some people have actually proposed that. But, I could give him 10 model answers, but, the idea of one model answer, I think, is really the teacher imposing, his or her standpoint and interpretation on the students rather than encouraging creativity there. I wonder if we could turn then to look at what information is available to students during the exam, let's say in the exam hall, which I realize is more of a virtual than a physical concept these days, but in the exam hall. One of the things that you mentioned in your TEDx talk, which I enjoyed very much, was whether students should have access to the internet during exams. So let's come back to that. Let's leave that to one side for now. Could we first address perhaps the distinction between closed book exams and open book exams? Now, for anyone looking in, many people looking in will know what that distinction is, but just in case anyone is not familiar, in a closed book exam, the students will go in with, nothing other than pen and paper. So they have nothing by way of source material to assist them when answering the questions. By contrast, in an open book exam, they might be allowed to take certain materials in. It might be a textbook, it might be their own notes, or some other sources. Brian, what's your take on open and closed exams? Now, obviously, some institutions might have requirements or expectations, but do you tend to favour open over closed or vice versa? And how do you form a view on that?
So most of my exams, just for practical reasons, tend to be closed book exams. But that's more just a technical, logistical element, right? In terms of maintaining the integrity of the exam, that's a lot easier when everyone walks in holding nothing but a pen or a pencil, and you don't have to worry that they have something they shouldn't have. The way I sort of justify this is I try to write my exams such that having an open book wouldn't help. Now, some topics, some courses, this is just necessary. There's just things you need to know to be able to apply. So a mathematically based course, there might be, here's a list of formula that you need, right? We don't expect you to memorize, but you're going to need to use. In which case, I will provide them, here's some pages with all the details you need. But going back to the previous idea that if a book would help you, then that probably tells me this was a bad question, because if it's something you can look up in a book in the 2 or 3 minutes that you're going to have for this question, then that's probably not a good question, because that's asking you content as opposed to process. So I try to design my questions in such a way that the content is already there. I'll give you the formula. I'll give you the structure. I'll give you whatever information you need. What I want to do is get you to apply the process. And the other thing with the open versus closed book, I know from my experience as a student, I always found that the problem with open book exams is it often was heavily rewarding just the people who either happen to bring the right thing, or if it's a textbook that everyone brings, fine, because everyone's got the same textbook. I don't assign textbooks because we could have a whole other interview about some of the issues of textbook publishing. But if it's you can bring one page back and front, well, that comes down, I didn't happen to write that one thing. So I generally tend to say, here's the material you need. It's all there. I will provide it for you so you don't have to guess at what it's going to be. Now what I want to see is I want to watch you show me how you actually manipulate this, and show me the process you go through using that material.
That's interesting. So the closed book exam might enable us to create perhaps a more controlled environment in terms of access to sources or access to information. I find that with open book exams, because I've run both of these things, and I actually have never really formed a fixed view on which I think is better. But I found that in open book exams, the students are almost lulled into a false sense of security, because the textbook or the notes or whatever become a crutch. Now, it's a false sense of security, because as you say, when you're writing questions, particularly in an open book exam, they have to be written in such a way that students cannot simply look up the answers. So whether that's the depth of the complexity of the question, or bringing in a number of different areas in an intertwined way, that could only be successfully managed by someone who had studied this stuff properly. But I found that there's maybe a risk, perhaps, of students being more likely to be underprepared in an open book exam. Is that something you've encountered?
Yeah, so we've had some attempts of this. So in computer science, one of the examples, instead of an open book, we've had open file system, where you have a computer in front of you that you can actually try your code and run your code and process things. And either because, there's also just the fact of handwriting versus typing. With computer science, often, just the fact that you can type faster than you can write for most students nowadays makes a big difference. But often we said, okay, you can have whatever code ready on your file system. We shut down the internet once the test starts, but you can have whatever you want on the computer. Again, there's some logistics issues with that. But often what you find is then students will go and they will, it's the extreme version of this. Instead of, okay, I'm going to bring the textbook and my notes and this, it's I'm going to have downloaded 1 million files ahead of time. And so you have a limited amount of time on the computer during the test, and you spend 20 minutes looking for the appropriate file and reading it instead of answering the question. And it winds up becoming in the same, way that I don't want my exams to be largely dependent on how fast you can type or how fast you can write. I also don't necessarily want them to be, how quickly you can look up that material or how well you indexed this material. And that's part of why, if possible, I try to say, look, I'm providing this information so everyone has it. It's very clear which bits you need. That's the focus.
It's interesting you've brought up the point about actually how the students submit their answers. It wasn't something I was planning to ask you about, but actually it's a good point. The handwriting issue is something that drives me crazy because I don't know, 60 to 70% of student answers, I find the handwriting, I spend half my time trying to work out what has been written, rather than actually, does this make sense from a subject matter assessment perspective? And I just don't know why things are done on paper any longer in institutions, not to mention the amount of paper that's wasted. Why not just put this stuff into a computer unless there's some specific reason why that cannot be done? You've offered really interesting insights there. Now, I would like to bring in internet access here because I think you had mentioned, I keep referencing your TEDx talk, but I found it fascinating. One of the things you mentioned, I think, was that the exam hall might be the only or the last time that the students don't have access to unlimited information. So, I don't profess to know anything about your field, but I'm guessing when people go and work in industry and, they're asked to solve problems, and then they will typically have access to unlimited information, the internet being the obvious source there, and law's no really different in that regard. Are you a proponent of the idea that there should be unlimited internet access to students during exams? Do you think that would help us achieve what we think the objectives of the assessment exercise are?
So there's two components to it. One is them getting outside information, and the second is them getting outside help, right? So in a perfect world, absolutely, they should have access to the internet, because it is silly to write an exam where you don't have access to the actual things you're going to need in the real world. The problem is that how can you stop, once they have access to the internet, they have access to the internet, which means they have access to these services where people say, hey, pay me some token amount and I'll answer the questions for you. Or, hey, I'm sitting next to you writing the test, I will share my answers with you. Now, there's arguments for, fine, we do that, right? We say, let them work in groups, let them subcontracting at work, maybe that's problematic. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the point of me evaluating is I want to know what you have learned from this course. And as soon as I open the internet to you, that the integrity of that really is very difficult to maintain. There has been some interesting examples. One really interesting project that I should have brought the source for, maybe I can give it to you and you can link to it afterwards. But there was one institution where what they did is they allowed their students to have internet access, but the only thing they had access to was the Google cache. So the idea is you have access to what is essentially a 24-hour-old version of the internet. So you can have, maybe you put some material up there that you find useful, or you can search, you can access things, but you can't communicate with anybody. So that, I think, would be a very promising model, because it gives you have unlimited information, but essentially you can't communicate out. And that still tells me, can you process that information without, can you go and ask someone for help that you shouldn't be getting? But I think it just comes down to, if I could entirely trust that the only thing the students were going to access the internet for is pulling information, absolutely, they should have access to it. But I don't yet know of a good, solid model where you can give them that access without giving them access to these, services or other students answering the questions for them.
That's interesting. The integrity aspect. I mean, that's a fantastic point. I wonder, and I'm thinking this through, as I'm listening to you. So I don't really have a fixed view on this, but I kind of wonder in my field how useful internet access might be. I mean, I'm guessing that. Well, I'm confident that computer science travels better than law, because law is one of the few disciplines, I guess, which really varies based on where you are, unless you're doing international law or something. So, I can be an expert even in a specific area of law, but actually I know very little about the same area elsewhere. That might also reduce the possibilities, not eliminate, but reduce the possibilities for outside help to be readily available. There is so much in terms of where we get the kind of the main source material from in law. It tends to be locked up in certain databases and so on, rather than being freely available online. A lot of stuff is not open access. So I'm just kind of sitting here digesting whether I think that would be useful or not. Maybe it varies from subject area to subject area. If in your discipline, the integrity aspect could be taken care of via some technological solution and ensuring people are not, subcontracting out their exam answers, because clearly that's not acceptable. Do you feel that, is there some additional potential for maybe creativity or improved performance on the part of students in your discipline if they're given that internet access during exams?
Yeah, absolutely. So the current course I'm teaching this semester, I encourage the students. So what I've done, because of this weird model where we can't do in-person exams because some of our students are in other continents, they have a take-home exam. And what I have done is I have said, well, let's embrace this. And you're going to have something like 48 hours to complete this work. And in fact, I'm saying, go find other sources, find other things out there and incorporate them. Now, it's very important that you clearly tell me what you did versus what you found versus what you had someone else do. But suddenly when I sort of, it was difficult for me to wrap my head around this. But once I accepted that, I said, suddenly instead of my exam being, okay, here's this very simple problem I want you to solve. And it's, I have to very carefully articulate exactly the parameters, and students do it. And it's very dull and dry. The assignment can be, okay, go find something cool and build something on top of it. And suddenly they have the whole world to play with. And it really opens up much more interesting possibilities. I think the students are finding it, the ones who are not daunted by it or are not scared about, finding the appropriate level. They're suddenly like, oh, this is way more interesting, instead of here's a file of data, process it in this way, and we mark you whether your result file looks like our result file. It's go find something you're interested in and do these interesting things with it and tell us where you got the information. That's fine. Now, you do run into the integrity problem. So what we're doing now is we are actually saying, okay, you're not even submitting your work. You are explaining your work to us. You are going to demonstrate what you did. You're going to talk us through, and we're going to ask you some questions. It's actually going back to the old style of sort of the viva voce examination more. It doesn't scale as well. There are certainly issues we are going to have to really deal with, fairness and integrity and scale. But it suddenly I realized, like, hey, I think this actually does do a better job at, again, evaluating that process that you went through. Can you explain what you did and explain how you improved upon this? That's actually a much better representation of what you learned in my course.
That's really fascinating, especially the oral exam aspect to that. I had a year abroad, and I had I faced oral exams for the first time in my undergraduate degree during that year abroad, and I did very well on them. But yeah, you know, the integrity issue is pretty much taken care of. I mean, unless you've got an earpiece in or something. But also, it somehow felt less constrained. I remember as a student, it felt less framed. And of course, you know, you have to come up with the answers there and then. You can't sit thinking for ages necessarily before you answer the question. But that's really a fascinating solution, perhaps, to some of these creativity issues. Although, as you mentioned, it doesn't scale that well. I mean, it can have huge resource burdens if you've got a really big cohort of students, for example. I mean, on this topic, if we could kind of bring this into a final perspective, we hear so much about innovation in teaching. And again, this might vary by country or by institution, but I don't get the sense that we hear as much about innovation in assessment. Perhaps you disagree with that, I don't know, but I don't see either as many initiatives for that or as many examples of people taking the initiative there. First of all, do you agree that there hasn't been as much innovation in assessment as there has been perhaps on the teaching side? And secondly, if yes, why do you think we're not seeing that kind of innovation in assessments?
So I absolutely agree with that. I think, you know, the fact is we've done some really interesting stuff. You know, the fact that the sage on the stage lecture is now almost a derogatory term, right? This idea of, oh, you're doing this very arcane way of, you're not doing anything inverted, you're not doing anything active learning. For most people, it's just, that's not even considered modern teaching. And all these people do these amazing, interesting things in their classroom, and then at the end have a sat down 2-hour pen and paper, essentially multiple choice with a few variations exam. You know, this is still the same style of exam that would have been decades ago. I think that the two things that are holding us back there is integrity and scale. You know, the standard pen and paper sitting at a desk exam is very easy to ensure that it is fair, both from the student point of view and from the teacher point of view. The other side that we didn't really get to with sort of the viva voce examination is, you know, that there is relative confidence that you are being assessed fairly as a student, that I'm not, oh, you know, I was a bit tired when I was listening to you, so I marked you harder, or I asked you different questions, and this person I like, so I asked them easier questions or whatever. That's very difficult to manage as soon as you're opening the constraints. And then it's just an issue of scale. I know in our world in computer science, we are dealing with, you know, 1,000 student classes is sort of a norm now. A lot of these models that would be totally fine with, you know, 10 or 20 students, maybe 100 students, they just don't scale up into the thousands. So you kind of have to figure out that balance. And, you know, I think that's what's keeping us conservative in our assessment styles. We're sort of saying, look, we know this works. We know it can scale. We know we can maintain the integrity. And it sort of does okay at the actual efficacy of the exam. So we're not playing with it too much. And I do think that's a shame. I actually think COVID is potentially helping, because it's, you know, it's breaking some of our exam systems where people are saying, well, I couldn't maintain the integrity, or I had to try it in this different way. And it's maybe forcing people to assess the way they do things a bit differently.
That's so interesting. And I think of the you know, the flipped classroom, which so many people are talking about now. And of course, there are people who are genuinely interested in exploring whether this, or the extent to which this is a viable teaching model. But I always have the suspicion that a certain percentage of these people are just doing it to, you know, jump on the bandwagon or something. And I wonder if there was more of a drive at more senior levels of institutions, or perhaps some funding bodies and so on, to incentivize or push for innovation in assessment, if we might see some more impetus here. Brian, I would like to come, if I may, to the final question, which viewers of this channel will now know that I always put to the guests at the end, and that is, if they could change one thing about academia, what would that thing be for you, Brian?
So I think it's the barriers to entry at all levels. We've done some good work in the past generations at getting a diversity into academia. And I don't just mean in terms of gender and skin color, but in terms of ideas and in terms of background and in terms of experience. But the fact is that as long as the institutions are built with this default assumption that the only people walking in those doors are people who can afford to suspend their lives for multiple years and put up with potentially big debts and put everything else aside and ignore all the other family and responsibilities and work to just focus on their academic level, whether it's undergraduate, graduate, postdoctoral, getting, professorships, you're excluding a lot of people who would really help change things and move things forward and shake things up. They're just not in the door because they're never going to pass those barriers. So I think that's something that we really need to work on. And we are getting better at some of these areas, but the fact that you have to be willing to say, okay, well, I'm going to take on a big financial burden and put my life on hold for 4 years or 7 years or however long in order to get in, you're limiting the types of people who can be part of that institution.
There's an interesting legal analogy there because, we talk about access to justice, and what we typically mean by that is, people's ability in terms of finances and resources, also time, to actually go and litigate. So to some extent, you're only halfway there if the substantive law confers meaningful legal protections on people. If they cannot actually go and assert and protect those rights in court, then actually you're just building massive structural inequalities into the legal system. Now the question then becomes, how do we fix that? So how do we fix the concern that you're talking about? Is it a case of throwing more money at it, or is it something else?
So money helps. I don't think anyone is going to argue that, getting better scholarship systems, reducing the financial burden of students, not putting people in a place where they have to decide, okay, I'm going to have huge amounts of money that I'm going to owe when I leave. That is definitely part of the equation. But I do also think there's other systemic issues that we have to be more flexible in terms of, we can't assume that all undergraduate degrees are going to be 4-year full-time, someone entering at 19 years old and leaving at 20 whatever years old. We have to accept that some of these people might take longer. Some of these people might be arriving later. Some of these people might be pausing to raise a family and then wanting to continue. And this goes all the way through. This is for undergraduate students, graduate students, postdoctoral, faculty. The fact that you should be able to have a different path that winds up getting you to where you need to go. We've been, I think, historically very narrow in at each level what we consider as an appropriate path to get to the next level. And I think we need to start thinking about expanding those possibilities.
Interesting. Can I just ask just a quick final question on that? Because what I'm thinking about when you're running me through that is that another potential barrier is, the fact that, not at the moment, but universities generally require physical presence. You have to up sticks and move to, a city. It could be quite far away, it could be, very far away. And not everyone's in a position to do that. Now, one of the things that we've learned through the pandemic is it is possible to give actually quality education at distance, even to people in different continents, time zone issues notwithstanding. There are still very, very few distance learning opportunities available, right? Because it's a limited number of institutions that offer this, and they tend to be more online masters and so on, rather than online bachelors. At least that's my experience. Do you feel that's another area where universities can make more of an offering to say, look, either here is a degree program or a course which is entirely online, or you can join it online if you wish, or you can come physically if you wish. And is that not also going to open education up to people who, for perhaps family commitments, care commitments, even for financial reasons, cannot simply up sticks and move to some other city for 3, 4, 5 years?
I think there's definitely a huge potential for that, right? And I think the pandemic has shown us this, that partially it's shown us that this is possible. And I think it's also shown us that we're not generally good at it. I don't blame anyone for it. I don't think I'm very good at teaching online because I've developed my teaching with the assumption that I'm going to be in a room with people. But I think that people are starting to realize that this is viable and that we could actually get good quality education. It's not just you can get the online, position of some half scam, half you get an accreditation institutions. That no, you can actually get a good quality education that might prepare you for something like graduate school online, or looking at maybe you could be doing graduate school online that would prepare you for academia online, or maybe you can be an academic who doesn't need to be physically on campus all the time and who can potentially get tenure with having some open possibilities. I think our institutions aren't well set up for that at the moment. I think they need to become ready for that, because I don't think this is going away. I don't think the world is just going to go back to, okay, well, pandemic's over, everyone go back to the world as it was. You've opened the doors to a lot of interesting situations that people are going to want to leverage. And I think it also means that you're going to have maybe some institutions that weren't the big players before who can maybe enter into this space. I don't think the big, well-known, been around forever academic institutions are, a lot of them, fine, I'm going to go back at University of Toronto. Pretty much we're all desperate to get back to being in person because that's what we do well. But maybe there's someone else who can say, okay, we're going to enter this new space of giving really high quality education online. And I think there's some really good potential, not just for the institutions, but for academia as a whole, bringing in people who otherwise just weren't going to get their foot in the door.
Wow, there's so much in that. And, I think the sign of an interesting interview or discussion is when you get to the end, you have even more questions you would like to go through than when you started. So, look, Brian, I'm so grateful for your time, and it's been such a pleasure to speak to someone outside of my discipline, not just because it's nice to speak to someone who does something else, but also it just, opens up a whole range of other dimensions and perspectives. So, look, thank you so much for speaking to me today. I really appreciate that.
Oh, thank you. I had a great time. I thought it was a really interesting conversation.
Well, that was Dr. Brian Harrington, Associate Professor of Computer Science at the University of Toronto. I hope you found that interesting. Certainly for me, it was fascinating to speak to someone who ultimately is in a very different field from me, but is still an academic at the end of the day, still trying to do the same thing with his students. So thank you to Dr. Harrington for his time. I hope you found it interesting. Please feel free to engage by leaving your comments below this video. Like the video if you thought it was useful, or let someone else know about the video if you think they can learn something from it. And if you do find this channel interesting, you're free to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so that you're informed when new videos are uploaded, which generally is on a weekly basis. So thanks very much for looking in, and I'll see you next time.